Big news for anyone who loves the history of D-Day. Matt McLachlan Battlefield Tours has just launched a brand new tour that visits the D-Day beaches and lots of other sites in rural France, and all from the comfort of a luxurious cruise on the Seine River. Now, we ran this tour in 2024 and it was a huge success. It sold out in a matter of weeks. So now we've rolled it out again for 2025. But this time, there'll be 3 departures in June, July and September, giving you 3 times the opportunity to join us. The cruise is on board the luxurious Amadeus Diamond and begins and ends in Paris. Over 8 days, you'll enjoy the history, scenery and culture of the beautiful Seine River. But as an exclusive offering just for our passengers, you'll enjoy 2 full days touring the D-Day landing beaches in both the US and British sectors, plus daily seminars on board the ship that unpack the history of D-Day. And like all our tours, you'll be hosted by one of our expert historians who'll bring the story of D-Day to life. And if you've been on one of our tours before, you'll know that our historians really are the best there is. This is an exclusive cruise and places are extremely limited. Visit battlefields.com.au to book your place today.
When it comes to weight loss, no 2 people are the same. That's why Noom builds personalized plans based on your unique psychology and biology. Take Brittany. After years of unsustainable diets, Noom helped her lose 20 pounds and keep it off.
I was definitely in a yo-yo cycle for years of just losing weight, gaining weight, and it was exhausting.
And Stephanie. She's a former D1 athlete who knew she couldn't outtrain her diet, and she lost 38 pounds.
My relationship to food before Noom was never consistent.
And Evan, he can't stand salads, but he still lost 50 pounds with Noom.
I never really was a salad guy. That's just not who I am. Even through the pickiness, Noom taught me that building better habits builds a healthier lifestyle. I'm not doing this to get to a number. I'm doing this to feel better.
Get your personalized plan today at Noom.com. Real Noom users compensated to provide their story. In 4 weeks, the typical Noom user can expect to lose 1 to 2 pounds per week. Individual results may vary.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See detail.
A Living History production.
I'm Matt McLachlan.
And I'm Pete Smith.
We're battlefield historians who love nothing better than getting out and walking the ground where great battles in history took place.
And now we'd like you to come with us. Every week, BattleWalks will take you to one of the great battlefields of Europe.
As we walk the ground, we'll dig through the pages of history. We'll uncover the secrets of the battlefields, and most importantly, we'll tell the stories of the people who fought and died there.
Welcome to BattleWalks.
Hello everyone, thank you for joining us once again as we walk the great battlefields of Europe on BattleWalks. I'm excited about this one. We're heading back to Europe, heading back to Belgium in fact, which we haven't done for a little while, and we're doing World War II. We always get a great response to the World War II episodes that we do. We focus a lot on World War I because it's a passion of both Pete's and mine, but we always get a lot of great responses when we do World War II, and we love doing World War II battlefields. So hopefully many more of these coming up. This one, we're doing the Battle of the Bulge. We're doing the area around Bastogne in Belgium. It's going to be a great one. And joining me, as always, to walk this battlefield is the one and only Pete Smith. Pete, welcome back.
Hi, Matt. Yep, nice to be back with you.
Looking forward to this one, mate. I have to say, I'm going to do a full disclosure now to everyone listening that I have not actually walked this battlefield in reality. So many times I've been supposed to go to Bastogne and to the area around the Battle of the Bulge to explore it during tours of Europe, and I've never made it there for whatever reason. I will say at the outset, that's probably because it's not necessarily that easy to get to. This is in an odd little corner of Belgium. You don't generally travel there on your way to and from anywhere. Is that a fair assessment?
It is, Matt. Yeah, it's up in the corner that I suppose, where would you be going? It's one of the routes you could get into Germany from there, but it wouldn't be a natural route really. So no, it's just tucked up in the corner. It's where Luxembourg, I suppose, that's where you'd be going because it's right beside Luxembourg. In fact, it's part of the Ardennes region. Luxembourg, Germany, Belgium all have an area of the Ardennes. It covers a mainly wooded area, very mountainous, hilly, and so it's a junction. Belgium, Holland's not even that far away, so it's right on the border of Germany, and that's the interesting point, I suppose, for what we're going to be talking about today.
Now, this was really the Germans' last roll of the dice in the West during the Second World War. This was Hitler's last gamble to try and, ridiculously to try and defeat the Western Allies on the Western Front during the Second World War, and so it took place right at the very end of 1944, stretching into the early part of 45. A very costly battle for both the Germans and the Allies involved. Pete, why don't you give us one of your excellent 2-minute potted histories of the Battle of the Bulge, so we know why this area is so important.
Okay, so first of all, the battle, to the date when it started, 16th of December. It's an attempt by the Germans to break through and to split basically the British from the Americans and to drive a wedge all the way to Antwerp if possible. Now, whose battle is this? Who initiated it? Who planned it? Well, it's absolutely Hitler. So it's none of his generals. It is completely planned by him. In fact, most of his generals were totally against it in one way or another for various reasons. What is it going to do? Well, it's going to use up the last of the German army, really, in this push. Would it have won them the war? No, it wouldn't. It definitely would not have won them the war. But what it could have done, it's so similar to the Germans' last roll of the dice in 1918. That if the Germans had broken through in 1918, which they did, but did they get to the coast? Not quite. But would that have won them the war? Would they have succeeded in 1918 in eventually beating the Allies effectively? No, they wouldn't, and it's the same at this point. But what they're hoping is that there will be a treaty, that there'll be a pause, there will be some kind of the war will stop, and the Germans will be in a better position to not exactly dictate terms, but have their say about what should happen next.
Can we just touch on that point, Pete? Because I think that's a fascinating aspect of the history and the incredible misread by Hitler and the German commanders about what was going on. That ideal, that objective to try and improve your position in upcoming peace negotiations made some sense during the First World War. That in 1918, when everyone was exhausted, when Germany had made a very good account of itself and had captured large parts of France and Belgium and was at the time of that fighting in a relatively strong position. Obviously, they would go on to lose the war, but they were in an okay position. That made some sense, that if they took large chunks of the land, if they split armies and were in a dominant position, that it could have forced a very war-weary Allied populace to give them better terms in a peace negotiation. That made sense during the First World War. It absolutely did not make any sense in the Second World War, mostly because the Allies had learnt their lesson from the first time around, that they were not, and especially with Hitler, with the Holocaust, with all of the evil aspects of the Nazi Empire, there was no way that the war was going to end with anything other than the complete destruction of that German machine. So it wasn't a particularly good plan in the First World War, and it was a disastrously impossible plan in the Second World War.
Yeah, indeed. And at this point, General Guderian really wanted to use the last of the Wehrmacht, the last of the forces that were actually that you could still use, that were still cohesive, in holding holding the Russians back a little longer. And that was the worry. The Russians were slowly getting nearer and nearer to Berlin, and that's where he felt that the effort should be made. I think the other generals really just thought that the whole plan was too ambitious, but nobody's going to go up against Hitler. This was what he wanted. And you have to say, and this is what we're going to be talking about, it starts very well. Partly because of, again, I find this extraordinary really, partly because they came through the Ardennes again, and we were not ready. Well, you have to go back to 1940. We weren't ready in 1940 when they came through the Ardennes. So it's a surprise, but that's what they're going to do. They're going to come through the Ardennes, and Bastogne is right in their way. So this is why we're going to be here studying what we can see. And this, again, is not going to be the whole story of the battle. It's not going to be the whole story of what went on in the area. We're going to be having a walk around the town of Bastogne and having a look at what we can actually see, because it is crucial. It was, at the time, it was an absolute crucial location.
So tell us just what the Germans did in this attempt to break through and why it's known as the Battle of the Bulge.
Right. Well, the Battle of the Bulge is our name for it. In fact, the Germans called it the Ardennes Offensive, and I think most people actually called it the Ardennes Offensive. It's probably an American term, knowing the Americans, the Battle of the Bulge, and it's this bulge that is going to be created. And this is a great one for having a look at the maps. If you have a look at the maps, and you can see exactly what they're aiming to do, and they're aiming to get to Antwerp. And of course, Antwerp is the major port. It's the nearest major port. And so what we're going to get is, again, it's tanks. This is really a tank battle to start off with, German tanks bursting through. And in Bastogne particularly, now this has a very popularist I suppose, story that goes with it, and it's about the 101st Airborne, an easy company. For anybody that's watched any of the TV series, The Band of Brothers, then they will know that they were in Bastogne, and that's really why it's always been an interesting place to go to. If you're on a battlefield tour, then yes, of the Second World War and the fighting in that area, then you would go to probably end up in Bastogne. Well, without a shadow of a doubt, because as you'll see from some of the memorials there, some very important memorials here in Bastogne. So it's the 101st Airborne that gets stuck here, and it's them facing the German panzers. As we'll get as we slowly walk around the town, we'll get more of the story about some of the memorials that represent what was going on in the area.
I think it's fascinating that one of the aspects that is most interesting about this battle is the reason that the Ardennes forest in particular was not as heavily defended as it should have been by the Allies, is their assessment that it was a terrible place for tanks to operate. In the tightly wooded area, the narrow roads, the muddy ground, the snow, it was winter obviously, that it was a terrible place for tanks to operate, so they probably didn't defend it as well as they should have. And it's funny how in history and in warfare these things have a way of working themselves out, that even though they were unprepared for the start of the battle, that assessment was eventually proven quite correct, that this was a terrible environment for tanks to operate, and that was one of the big things that held the Germans up. The weather was a factor as well, but the fact that these were narrow wooded areas with narrow little roads and snow and mud, it did prove to be a disastrous place for tanks to try and operate in.
It's also, there's another issue, and that's because we have rivers here. The Meuse River is not that far away, and of course it also means you've got to seize the bridges, because if you're going to head to the coast, then if you don't seize the bridges and you've got tanks, then that's the end of it straight away, and that wasn't really achieved, and so it comes to a grinding halt very, very quickly. It's really just totally based upon this element of surprise, and it was a surprise, you have to say.
So basically the Germans launched this big attack. They succeeded in pushing the Americans back. This bulge was formed in a line, and several groups were rushed in to try and plug the gaps, including, as you mentioned, Easy Company and the 101st Airborne. And basically it became almost a siege, didn't it? Particularly around Bastogne. The Americans were quite besieged there for a while. The
other thing that's quite interesting is, and this has been used in warfare I suspect by the Germans quite often, but here it was maximised, and that was German soldiers dressed in American uniforms, and they were ahead of the advance, causing confusion. So it was something that was really planned very carefully, whereas it's a bit ad hoc. Putting on an enemy's uniform is always dangerous. You're going to be classed as a spy. But the Germans had really gone to some lengths to make sure that the German soldiers could speak very good American with a very good American accent, English with an American accent, and set them ahead at crossroads and misdirecting reinforcements moving up, and clever. And I suppose it's a clever battle. It had the potential, but it really from day one was not going to succeed.
The only thing that gave the Germans a good advantage at the start as well was the fact that the weather was so poor that the completely dominant Allied air power could not operate in a way that they potentially wanted to. But as soon as that weather cleared a few days into the battle, terrible scenes of German tanks getting blasted from the ground by air power. That was always going to be the case, particularly in the fighting in the West.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the cold helped them in some ways as well, because American soldiers in this area were not expecting to. They were just kind of on the border of Germany, preparing for an ongoing advance. But this is not where the big push was going to take place into Germany. So they're just really holding the line, and they were not particularly well equipped for this winter weather. And so that also is going to cause them a problem.
Well, let's begin the walk, Pete, 'cause it's a fascinating area, and as I said, I'm really looking forward to this one because I haven't done it on the ground. I certainly will as soon as I get back over to Europe. But I'm looking forward to this virtual exploration of the Battle of the Bulge, and particularly the sites in and around Bastogne. So where are we going to begin?
Okay, so we're going to start in the main square, which is called McAuliffe Square, and he's the commander of the 101st, the airborne, who are trapped here, and it was renamed in 1947 in his honour, so that's where we start. The one thing I would say here, before you come here, have a look online and see if you can find any photographs of the town taken during this period, because the then and now aspects makes it very interesting. Obviously, as Matt suggested, we spend a lot of time on the First World War battlefields, and nothing better than standing in a place and then imagining what it looked like during the war. But here, you don't have to imagine, really, because there's an awful lot of the buildings are the same buildings. You can even see the damage on them, bullet hits, bits that have been rebuilt, and so you can have some good fun holding a series of photographs and walking around the town and saying, "Oh, that's that building, and that was used as a headquarters," or whatever. So, always worthwhile having a look at it. In fact, I stayed in a hotel on one of my tours here. I stayed in a hotel in the square, and I remember getting a photograph out because I'd already pre-prepared, and looking out of my window, looking across the square, and a picture taken in 1944 during the fighting here, and it was the view from my bedroom window. So it really gives you that real feel of being there.
Just extraordinary.
Yeah, it is. It's and that is very different to the First World battlefields. Everything's been rebuilt, so nothing looks exactly as it had done. But here, it gives you a nice feeling of not quite being there, but you feel more attached to the people that were there when you can actually see the locations. Right in the square, and I have to say there are a lot of these, there were an awful lot of tanks in this area, and so tanks become part of the memorialisation of the fighting around here. And there's a Sherman tank in the middle of the town, in the middle of the square, from the 11th Armoured Division, known as the Thunderbolt Division. It's on a plinth, and it was actually knocked out on the 30th of December 1944, so right at the right period, and inaugurated there in 1947. So that's just worthwhile to go and have a look at a Sherman from the time that was actually there and fought in the battle. And there are a lot of these about. There's a lot of turrets. You'll find that every route into Bastogne has a turret embedded in a plinth at the side of the road. So you'll find a lot more, as we'll see as we're going on this walk. So that's the first thing to go and have a look at. Around the bottom of it, you'll get plinths to other units. So there is one to the 10th Armoured Division. There's a plaque to the 406 Fighter Group. And they were very successful once the weather lifted, as Matt just mentioned. So there's a plaque to them. And then right beside it, there's a Liberty Road marker. Now, these are fantastic. The Liberty Road was effectively the American advance into Germany. So they go right the way from the Normandy beaches, from Juno Beach. There's one right on there's a museum there. Right beside it, there's one of the Liberty markers, and every kilometre there's a marker all the way to here, to Bastogne. So this is where we have the last few markers are around the town here, and there's one of those. And it's a white, how would I describe it? It's a white, it's not obelisk because it's rounded, so it's a smooth, round little memorial that would sit beside a road, and on it there's the part of the Statue of Liberty. It's the flaming torch, it's just extraordinary if you're driving on the roads and you see these in any direction, following the route, and you see these Liberty markers. I think it was a great idea. I was just quickly trying to look at my notes and see when these were actually put in.
1946,
correct.
According to your notes.
Oh, yes, thank you. You're quicker at reading my own notes. So 1946, correct. And it's 1,145 kilometres, the whole length of it, or 712 miles, and every kilometre there's one of these. So, yeah, I think it was
So there's 1,145 markers between the Normandy landing beaches and Germany.
Correct. Yeah. Amazing, isn't it?
Absolutely extraordinary.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, amazing. Yeah.
I've seen the ones in Normandy. Obviously, that's as far on that route as I've advanced. But they are quite spectacular. And it was a French initiative, wasn't it? It wasn't the Americans that determined it was a French initiative in honour of the Americans.
It was indeed, yeah. And in fact, the very first one was placed at just outside of Paris, Saint-Symphorien, which is very much central. So that's where the first one, and then they started left and right, presumably. So I think it's great when you see them. They've all been kept very well, so it's good to see them.
Fantastic. What else is there to see in the square?
Right, in the square, one more thing, and that's the McAuliffe Memorial. It's a bronze bust commemorating the general who commanded the 101st Airborne, and it was sculptured by the sister of the Belgian ambassador to the United States at the time, and inaugurated by the general himself in 1950. Now, that's interesting. It shows that this place was seen as important. To the 101st Airborne, it was seen as an important place, a place to commemorate their fighting here because they were the people that really held the town. There were other people trapped in the town with them, but they were the guys that held on to it.
Let's talk about McAuliffe at this point and his fame, the thing he's most famous for during the siege of Bastogne. Let's talk about his response to the German commander, because it is brilliant and one of the great tales of the Second World War.
Yeah, it is. Basically, when they were cut off, they were surrounded, and the siege was from the 20th till the 27th of December. So it's not long, seven days, but it could have been a lot longer, It was tough for the guys that were in there, not knowing what was going to happen. They tried to airdrop supplies to them, so it was tough. So on the 22nd, the German commander von Luttwitz in the area dispatched a party to basically under a white flag to walk into the town and to ask for the American surrender. And the Americans had no thought of surrender at this point, so they let them through. And the McAuliffe then, his staff were told that they were outside, and they were told that they needed to respond. And his reaction was just, "Oh, nuts!" And he just meant he didn't know what to say really. "Oh, nuts! I've got to make a decision on what to say." Well, one of his lieutenant colonels, a chap called Harry Kennard, suggested that actually, rather than trying to think of anything else to say, why not use that? Just say nuts to them. And you have to say, no wonder the German officer was bewildered. He didn't know what it meant. So he had to ask, what does it actually mean? And he said, well, it means go to hell, effectively. Now, he didn't say that, as in McAuliffe didn't say that, because that's the whole point. Why he said nuts was he didn't swear. He was quite a religious chap, but didn't believe in swearing, and so that's how it ends up just being nuts rather than anything else. So it was explained to the German, and off he went, and off it went into history.
To put it into context, I might read out what the German emissary delivered to the Americans, because that's what I love most about it, is the formality of the Germans, demanding this surrender, and then the American reply. So this is what the Germans wrote to the Americans when they sent in that envoy. To the USA commander of the encircled town of Bastogne, the fortune of war is changing. This time the USA forces in and near Bastogne have been encircled by strong German armoured units. More German armoured units have crossed the River Or near Orthouville, have taken Marche, and reached St. Hubert by passing through Homprey-Sibert-Tilley. Libremont is in German hands. There is only one possibility to save the encircled USA troops from total annihilation. That is the honourable surrender of the encircled town. In order to think it over, a term of 2 hours will be granted, beginning with the presentation of this note. If this proposal should be rejected, 1 German artillery corps and 6 heavy AA battalions are ready to annihilate the USA troops in and near Bastogne. The order for firing will be given immediately after this 2-hour term. All the serious civilian losses caused by this artillery fire would not correspond with the well-known American humanity. The German commander. And so that I just love that. It's just so Germanic. There's the officiousness, the arrogance, the formality of the note, delivered in excellent English, you must say. And then in response, what the Germans receive is, to the German commander, nuts. The American commander.
Yeah,
what a great story. It's one of those that seems apocryphal. It seems like that can't possibly have happened. If a Hollywood scriptwriter wrote it, you'd think it was too much of an exaggeration.
You would indeed.
But that's the reality. And well-chosen words, because they went on to absolutely kick the Germans' butts in the coming battle. So just what a great little chapter of the story.
I think it's interesting as well. It's bluff and bluster from the Germans, because when they received these nuts, did the town then get plastered by hundreds of guns firing at them? No, nothing happened whatsoever. So it was bluff and bluster as well. The Germans didn't have all of the guns, and in fact, the only reason the town came under heavy bombardment is from when the weather changed. It did allow some German bombers to get in. Not that many were flying, as we said, because of our air superiority, but it was bombed during the siege. And that's really the next story, really. We're going to leave the square, And we're going to head down a little road called Rue de Neufchâteau and to number 21. And there we'll find a plaque on the side of the building. Now, this is to a nurse called Renée Lemaire. And she is depicted in that Band of Brothers TV series, not accurately, because she was killed actually when she was looking after some wounded, and it's depicted that she was in the church, and she wasn't. It was this house that we're standing in front of is where she was actually looking after 30 Americans. She had 30 Americans under her care, all of whom were killed, and she was killed as well. I've tried to do a little bit of reading about her and also her death, and again, conflicting stories. Sometimes you just cannot put your finger on exactly what happened. Some rather horrific stories that she was found very badly mutilated by the bomb. Others that she'd came out of the building and went back in to try and rescue the wounded and was killed when the building collapsed. I tend to believe the former, actually, that I think she was killed when the bomb landed straight off, and I think it's just been a little exaggerated over the years. But no matter what, she didn't need to be there. She wasn't even nursing in this area. She had been nursing in Brussels, and she was home to see her parents and got caught up in the fighting. And of course, you have to remember that at that time, she can go and see her parents now. People can start moving about. The Germans have been forced out the area because it was the 10th of September 1944 that this town had been retaken. So you have to think what that meant to the townspeople. At last they felt that they were free, and then to suddenly find themselves surrounded. Even worse for some of the villages that the Germans did occupy. And this is a little story that I found very, I suppose, disconcerting. That's not quite the right word, but uncomfortable with it. I've never lived under an occupation of an occupying force, and very few people that listen to these podcasts will have been. But I think it must have been a very difficult time. If you imagine that you're in a village and you've been occupied for a length of time by the Germans, what do you do with your families? How do you react to that? Some people decided to accept the Germans and sometimes not be, I suppose, be friendly towards them. Other people were in the resistance. Well, so one of the sad things that happened, when the Germans were forced back, the people that had been in the resistance let themselves be known because the Germans had been forced back. That's the end. But when the Germans came back and overran these villages again, some of those that had been supporting the Germans then said, as the Germans came back, oh, you know, so-and-so over there, they were in the resistance. They've been spouting off their mouths and saying, oh, we were in the resistance and we didn't tell anybody. Well, the Germans came back and they were informed of these details, and those people were rounded up and executed. So there were some horrible aspects of this Germans reoccupying an area that they'd been forced out of. Anyway, back to Renée. She was tending to the wounded, killed. There's now a memorial plaque on the building commemorating her service. And there's been a drive to go further than that because the Americans didn't ever give her any kind of award for the service. But we do find that her headstone, she's buried in the local communal cemetery. You can, it's a little at the other side of the town, but I've been to go and have a look at her grave, and it was paid for by the US Army Nursing Corps, paid for her headstone on her grave. But it's just one of those very sad little stories, in the wrong place at the wrong time, you'd have to say, but doing the best to help the people that are freeing her country, the Americans that are freeing her country and killed in doing that.
Just a few interesting aspects to that story, Pete, that I think are fascinating as you were giving that excellent account. The story about how she died, it just struck me that the importance of propaganda in wartime, that both of those stories, whether she was killed in the initial bomb blast and horribly mutilated, or whether she ran back into the building to save people and was then killed, both of those are important elements of a good propaganda story. Quite different propaganda stories, but both of them are important elements of the story. The first one, the idea that she was a nurse and therefore a non-combatant, really a guardian angel on the battlefield helping the wounded, and the fact that she was horribly mutilated is part of the story to depict the evil, especially we see this all the time in the First World War, the evil Germans, the Huns, the barbaric Huns. So that's an important part of an Allied propaganda story to depict this. She's innocent. She's seen as pure on the battlefields, but then she was horribly mutilated by the nasty Germans. But also then the second one, which is probably a little more obvious, is that she was a hero. The idea that she ran back into a building and she could have saved herself and didn't. So that's the fact that we don't know. The fact that we don't know exactly what happened to her speaks of the importance of propaganda with these stories after the fact in the late stages of the war. But also, you mentioned the German reprisals against civilians when they came back, but also the terrible fate of the collaborators, the people who who had gone along, young women who for most of their lives had been under German occupation, so it was not surprising that some young women fell in love with German soldiers and had relationships and things. The reprisals the local people carried out on the people they considered traitors and collaborators was just horrific. And again, that's depicted about in the Holland episode of Band of Brothers, that the cutting of the hair and the humiliation of people in the squares. It's just an awful aspect of occupation and warfare.
It's funny when you're driving the battlefields and you're exploring the battlefields, you come across very odd little memorials. And a few years ago, in the middle of a field, so this is actually in northern France, nearer to the coast from where I live, and in the middle of a field there was a memorial. We could see it. There was no obvious way to get to it. Luckily, the crops were not in, and it was ploughed, and it was a bit of a muddy old day. And I thought, I'm determined to go and see why this memorial just in the middle of a field with no walk. And we walked across to it, and it was a memorial to a young girl, a 17-year-old girl who'd been walking back from the German positions. The German barracks were close by, back to her village. Almost certainly had a German boyfriend. And when we looked carefully, the memorial had been built by the Germans. So this memorial had been put up to commemorate the loss of a young girl from the local village who'd been, obviously I would guess almost certainly, a boyfriend or a girlfriend of one of the German soldiers. That's why it wasn't looked after, because to the local people, she would have been seen as a collaborator, and even though she was killed in tragic circumstances in a bombing raid, she still was a collaborator. So we went to the local war memorial. She wasn't on the local war memorial from the village that she'd been travelling from, and so a very sad little story, really. And I felt like I wanted to look after the memorial to commemorate her and just humanity, really, to commemorate what went on in wartime. Because at some stage a tractor's going to clonk this thing, and it's going to be gone, and nobody will care once it's gone. So just little stories that you find as you're zigzagging across the countryside.
And I'd say that, especially throughout this region of Europe, and especially as we're talking about the Second World War, never overlook the role of civilians and the terrible price paid by civilians throughout this fighting, because they were part and parcel of everything that went on, unlike the First World War, where thankfully the majority of civilians were cleared from the battlefield area. In this area, civilians were just caught up in the fighting every step of the way. So, we should always just stop and remember them as well. Innocent people caught up in terrible fighting.
It's an interesting point, isn't it, Matt, that we should have made earlier, really, I suppose, is up until this point, this area, there was no damage to it whatsoever, because this area had been taken very quickly in 1940 when the Germans invaded. Very little fighting took place, so the villages were absolutely intact. Most of the people living in these villages had never seen war, really. They'd been, yes, under German occupation, but this right at the end is when they get involved in the literal fighting war. But up until that point, this had been a little backwater, just very close to Germany. And in fact, if you go less than 10 miles up the road, the language changes to German. We're still in Belgium, but they actually speak German. So that's the kind of area that we're in. It's a multicultural area. Luxembourgians, Belgians, Germans, French not far in one direction and Dutch in the other. So it's a mishmash of peoples. So we're going to carry on down the road just a little bit further, so it's the same road, and we're going to turn a corner and head towards the 101st Airborne Museum. Now, I have to say, I didn't know what this museum was going to be like on my very first visit, but I was very impressed with it. It's a small, kind of almost private museum. It's in the former officers' mess of the Belgian army in Bastogne, so this is prior to the Second World War. The building wasn't damaged, so it's still, or only damaged lightly, so it's still the same building. But it's an excellent little museum with some lifelike tableaus, and the thing that I really enjoyed is going into, I know it sounds ridiculous, but you go into the cellar, into a bomb shelter, and they give you the impression of what it must have been like to be in the cellar by these background noises and rumbling and slight trembling of the benches that you're sitting on, and it goes dark, and you just for a second, you get a feeling of what it must have been like to be a civilian or a soldier in the cellars of the town, surrounded by the Germans, under bombardment, and wondering if you're going to survive. And I really enjoyed it, so I'd highly recommend 101st Airborne Museum.
Excellent. It's one of the great things about these places, isn't it? Is those small little museums. It's something that's changing. The museums, as more and more tourists come, we've mentioned this in previous podcasts, the nature of the museums is changing as government money comes along and they improve them and add toilets and coffee machines and make them a better place to visit. And they are, in terms of the raw facilities, they become a much better place to visit. But I lament a little bit the loss of the private nature of some of these museums. The small little museums are always the most interesting ones to discover. And so hopefully some of these museums stay in place for years to come.
I really do hope so. In these terrible times that we're in at the moment, it's a worry, isn't it? How many of these little museums, especially the private ones that don't have government money and have had no visitors for, and potentially will not have for 2 years, can they survive? And only time will tell. When we start exploring the battlefields again, let's hope they're still there.
Well said, Pete. Where are we heading to next on the walk?
Okay, back up to the main road again. Carry on down the main road, and we're going to a little small memorial. It's a tank turret. We've got a tank turret, a Sherman tank turret again, and beside it we've got a plaque, and it's commemorating an American lieutenant, Ernest Glasner, who was the first American to die in the town. So in the confines of the town, he was killed on this spot on the 10th of September 1944. So this is when they're first moving in, when the Americans arrive and successfully force the Germans out before the German counterattack. And he had destroyed a German tank with his bazooka. So he's an officer, but he grabbed the bazooka, ran into the road, destroyed a German tank, and then sadly was killed just after. And so his memorial is a turret of a Sherman with a 76mm gun. So one of the ones with a big extended gun, capable of knocking out, hopefully, some of the German tanks, which has always been a problem with tanks. We won't go into a tank talk today, I don't think. So it's one of those turrets beside the road. There are, in fact, 11. There are 11 preserved Sherman turrets around the town.
I think it's one of those little famous Matt and Pete's tangents we could take, Pete, when we get talking about pillboxes on the Western Front, we get bogged down talking about different types of concrete. I hope that the listeners come with us on that fascinating journey, but the same thing could occur talking about tanks in the Second World War. We won't, dear listeners, we won't subject you to it in this podcast, but perhaps in the future we'll do a special on tanks and pillboxes.
Yeah, well, in this case, if you go online, somebody's already done it. Somebody has done a little report on every tank turret around Bastogne. So it is online somewhere if you rummage online.
Well, you and I have talked at various times about doing a website about the various pillboxes that remain on the Western Front.
I think that would be a great one. Yeah.
So that will happen at some stage. But, I think, jokes aside, the importance of these things, tank turrets in Bastogne, pillboxes on the Western Front, the importance is they are tangible connections with the war. And that's what we're trying to do. That's the reason the reason we have this podcast, the reason we visit battlefields is we want those connections with history. And you need those tangible things. It's not enough to stand in a field and use your imagination and say, I can understand what it was like when fighting went on here. You need tangible connections with history, and that's why it's wonderful that these things have been preserved.
Yeah, it is. I mean, and important, because the days of I used to carry a lot of props with me, so inert grenades, a deactivated rifle, other bits and bobs, always handy to have and to bring out at various times. In fact, in my hand now I've got the jump wings from an American paratrooper in front of me. I pick them up, and I just like having those kind of things around when I'm doing the podcast. But I think it's important now, because we cannot carry those things around with us with ongoing security issues. We're not allowed to carry them anymore. So you need things to be in place that you can take people to and go and look at. And thankfully, a lot of these have started to be renovated. I think their worth was not recognised. They were just there. They were put there after the war at some stage. Almost forgotten about, going rusty, starting to fall to bits. Do we throw them away or do we renovate them? Thankfully, they've realised their importance, especially if you've got this tourist connection. You want people to come to your town and spend the money on your Belgian frites and etc. And so important that there are other things to look at. And that's what we're doing. We are walking around and looking at what has been preserved. So we're going to move on, and we're going to basically cut across to another street, just as a shortcut, cutting through to the Patton Monument. Patton, obviously, he's the American head honcho. He's the guy in charge, and there is a memorial to him. Become apparent in the story. He relieved the town when they're relieved, and eventually the German blockade is broken, and so that we have a monument to him. It is basically a limestone wall with his helmeted face cut into in a bas relief in the limestone wall, with very little to tell you anything else about it other than that there he is. And I just found it odd, really, almost I can't describe it really. It's just a very strange memorial. There he is, just staring out at you, wearing his helmet and nothing else. I don't mean as in naked. It's just his head, but he's just quantify that. Yeah, it's just an interesting memorial and very unusual, I would suggest.
I'm in two minds about good old Blood and Guts Patton because, his reputation has gone up and down throughout the years. The famous movie, I think, in the 70s depicting him. And, he certainly has we look at him through an interesting lens now, looking back. I've got to say, for his faults, I'm more of a fan than I am a detractor. I think he was a very, very good general. He was ruthless. There was no question. Blood and Guts was a well-earned nickname. But he did get things done. And if you study Patton before the Second World War, he was quite a fascinating character. He, for example, was a very dedicated student of warfare when he was training and doing his officer training. And you can look it up online, but he did a fascinating paper assessing Gallipoli as an amphibious landing. And considering the role he would play in the Normandy landings, it's really interesting the amount of detail he knew about the Gallipoli landing. It's basically a full assessment of what could have happened differently at Gallipoli, why it worked, why it didn't work. And for an American general to be talking about the Gallipoli landings in 1915 is really quite astonishing. Most Americans would never have heard of Gallipoli. He's at the end of the day, it's a fascinating story of Patton. He was killed right at the end of the war. He's buried in Europe, alongside his men. So it's an interesting story. And for all his detractors, I think he was a very good general at the end of the day, and he got some good stuff done during that American advance. Where do you stand on Patton, Pete?
Yeah, no, I agree entirely. The one thing I was just trying to remember is where he's buried. I think he's buried in Luxembourg. I think he's in the big American cemetery in Luxembourg, isn't he? Yeah, I've been. Normally, when I'm doing this tour, I take people across to go and see his grave in Luxembourg.
He was killed in a car accident late in the war.
He was, yeah, bizarrely. What's interesting is that he did a really good job here in relieving the pressure or solving the Battle of the Bulge. Basically, the American Third Army, which were heading up from the south, and they had to literally do a 90 degrees to it come to the aid of the men trapped in the Bulge area, and so amazing 90-degree turn on a 40-kilometer front. So he did a really good job in resolving this problem.
So we've paid our respects to the odd face of the naked General Patton, and then where to next?
Okay, so we're going to head now to the... we've about face, we've walked back through the square, and we're going up the other side of the town now. In fact, we're heading to perhaps the most important memorial in the area, the Madison Memorial, which I'll talk about later. But on the way to that, we're going to go past the Town Wall Memorial. Now, I always stop at the Town Wall Memorials. I cannot help myself. In this case, it is a war memorial that begins in the First World War, but it's actually created after the Second World War. For the very obvious reason, it was destroyed in the Second World War. And in fact, we've already walked past the church, and you can see a big lump of the original memorial is propped up beside the church of the original First World War memorial in the town. So this is a modernist memorial. It's quite stark, and it's commemorating those that lost their lives from this area in World War One and World War Two. Always worthwhile to have a look at them.
As we've said in previous podcasts, it's fascinating to think of I won't labour the point again for probably the third or fourth time, but it's just fascinating to think of French people. When we see a war memorial in Australia or in England, it talks about a strong sacrifice made by people to go off and fight in 2 world wars. But just the juxtaposition of the situation in France, where you had that same effect. You had young men from the village off fighting in far-flung corners in both world wars, but then also you had actually fighting in the town. You had people killed during the fighting in the town. And I always just wonder what it must have been like, particularly in the First World War, to be a Frenchman from a town in the Somme, for example, a Frenchman who grew up in Thiepval or Pozières, to be thinking while he's off fighting, hundreds of kilometres away in the French sector, to be thinking what was going on in his town, that this war was going on in his town. And I think if I was in that position, being from a small country town myself, hello to West Wyalong out in New South Wales, if I was off fighting in some far-flung corner of the battlefield and knew there was fighting going on in West Wyalong, I would want to be back there. I would be saying to myself, if I'm fighting in this war, why am I not fighting in my hometown rather than hundreds of kilometres away? So just what the French people had to endure, and indeed all the people of Europe during these wars, is just beyond comprehension.
I think it is, and of course in the Second World War they had the secondary issue, I suppose, that the young men who hadn't joined the army, hadn't been conscripted, hadn't got away quick enough and were still at home when the Germans overran these areas, then a lot of the young men were then enrolled into various labour groups, sent to Germany or sent to other areas to build fortifications or to work in factories. And so they dissipate as well. So even those that were not serving in the military, sadly, will not see home again until the war has finished. So again, it's well worth thinking of those. And very often these memorials carry an extra plaque, and it's for those that were taken away and sadly did not come back.
We mentioned in an episode a couple of weeks ago about Hamel in the Somme. We talked about the Australian Battle of 1918 to capture Hamel, and we mentioned that we do services with the local people in Hamel every Anzac Day. One of the ones that I think is always most moving is when the local people commemorate the villagers who were taken away by the Germans during the Second World War and who never returned. And there's always a memorial to those people that were taken away in the early days of the war, of the Second World War. This is and died in concentration camps or died in labouring for the Germans. So that's always very moving when the local people pay respects to their family members, their distant relatives who were deported. That's what they call it, the deportation memorial, by the Germans, never to return. So just again, you're right, Pete. We should always stop and look at the French memorials because, firstly, they're fascinating. They always tell an interesting story. But to just think about the depth of suffering that they represent.
Well, again, interestingly, I'll talk about just a recent experience this week, actually. I was out on one of my recces going to have a look at some of the villages behind the lines, and what I was actually looking for, I was literally looking for the graves of those killed in bombing raids. So these are French civilians killed in bombing raids. So I was looking in the civil cemeteries just to see, get an idea of the numbers of people who may be in the civil cemetery and the war memorials, the civilian war memorials. So not going to the Commonwealth War Grave cemeteries, which I normally do. It was totally looking in the civil cemeteries behind the lines here to have a look at what was going on and get a feel of what was happening in these little villages in northern France.
Where to next on our stroll, Pete?
Okay, so we're going to go to a very odd little memorial. It's just a wooden cross that has the names, they look like identity discs of 13 soldiers fastened onto this cross, and it's on a wall in a little bit of a ruined building. Well, it's a building that looks like it's ruined and has then been turned into a little garden area. And it's commemorating 13 American soldiers who were sadly killed after the fighting has left this area, were killed when they were loading landmines onto a lorry. And one of the landmines detonated and set the whole lot off, and it killed everybody that was in that area. And it was beside a regimental aid post, so which was a chapel, and that's where they're now commemorated. And that was actually created by a local chap in 1992. So again, it adds another extra interest, I suppose, that we have to think about, is that there are an awful lot of local people who are interested in the war, in the Second World War, interested in what went on in the area, and sometimes feel that something's missing, that there should have been a memorial to commemorate this terrible accident, and in this case, a chap called André Sen, I presume you pronounce his name. Again, we're back to my pronunciation of French and Belgian names. And he's had this little memorial put up, and well worth just making the effort to walk up the street and go and have a look at it. So then we're heading onwards, and we're still walking towards the Madison Memorial, which is just outside of the town. You're going to get great views from it looking back into the town, and we're going to come to another preserved German tank turret. This one has no explanatory information on it, but it's well worth having a look at because you can see exactly why this tank was knocked out, because there's a hole that goes right through the turret where you can see where a round actually entered the turret. So it's worthwhile going to have a look at. And beside it, there's another odd memorial, and it's to the nurses of Bastogne. So that's what it's called, the Nurses of Bastogne Memorial. To my mind, it looks like it's unfinished. And I put in my notes here, also odd, unfinished. But that's what it's for. It's a memorial commemorating the nurses that served during the siege, and all of these would be in the main civilian nurses who were in the area. So again, worthwhile having a look at. Then we're going to walk up the hill, and you start to see the memorial, the Madison Memorial. But what we're going to do before we get there, we're going to go into another museum, and this is the Bastogne War Museum. Now, this is unmissable. It is a fantastic museum, probably one of the best that I've been to on the battlefields. I really enjoy this museum. It's one where you're guided, so you are actually guided as you're going around. There's part of it is you can listen to your headsets, and other times people will come and talk about certain aspects that you'll. It's just a wonderful museum, great bookshop. It's got toilets. Always have to look for toilets on these tours. And a cafe, so you can also get a cup of coffee or tea if you need to as well, or something to eat. Actually, you can eat there as well. So well worth going to have a look at. It's all singing, all dancing. This one, it's got audio links. It's got depictions of what was going on. You even sit in the theatre and you get the feel of the men walking through the woods. So it's great. I highly recommend it.
Pete, you mentioned. When you mentioned that the tank turret with the hole in it, just a previous stop, something that just struck me there is that it's funny the interesting little things you discover about warfare that perhaps Hollywood has influenced our thoughts about how wars are fought and how battles take place. But it's worth noting that when a tank is knocked out, as we said, when a tank is destroyed during fighting, it can be the case that there's a big explosion and the turret gets blown off and the tank gets absolutely shattered. But very often, surprisingly often, you will see a knocked out tank which has virtually no damage on it except for one little hole. And the reason is these are high velocity armor piercing rounds that successfully penetrate the armor, and the reason the tank is knocked out is that round goes into the tank but then generally doesn't come out again and just effectively disintegrates and bounces around on the inside, which obviously has a pretty poor effect for the inside of the tank and the poor crew in there as well. So you'll see that so many times. You'll see a picture of a knocked out tank which just will have one round little hole in it, only a couple of inches across, which is where a high-velocity round pierced the tank and absolutely wreaked havoc on the inside. So again, I mean, it must be one of the most horrific aspects of fighting in warfare, but just being trapped in a tank with all this going on around you must be just truly terrible.
Well, I think in a previous podcast we talked about what it was like fighting inside a blockhouse or a bunker, and I think a tank is almost as bad. It's
a moving pillbox, isn't it? That's what it's designed to be. It's what it's designed to be on the battlefield. It's a pillbox in motion, and the same, just that nature being trapped. It's bad enough to be talk about wounds and death and the horrors of being in a war, but to combine that with the claustrophobia and the nature of being trapped, it's beyond awful.
I have to say, at 16, I nearly joined the Royal Armoured Corps. I'd signed up as a junior leader in the Royal Armoured Corps, and then I chickened out and joined the Commandos instead.
It's not too many people that ever express I chickened out and joined the Commandos instead. For listeners, there's a great statement right there. That sums up Pete Smith in one easy sentence. Another interesting memorial, Pete, that we're coming to now.
Okay, so this is a very small memorial, and it's a fairly recent memorial, 2008. And it's just an eagle looking down onto an upturned American helmet, and it's commemorating the 101st Airborne Division. Now, this is in between the Bastogne War Museum and the Madison Memorial.
Let's talk for a minute about Easy Company, 101st Airborne. Everyone knows them from Band of Brothers. And look, I'm as big a fan as anyone. It's a fantastic story. But I do think what we should also add at this point is they were not superhuman heroes who won the war. They were simply representative. And because of the book that came out and then eventually the miniseries, that company became the focus of so much attention. But we should remember that they were one of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of companies that were fighting in this area in all these great actions. And we should never... I know the airborne is very, very sexy. It is an amazing concept, the idea that guys were jumping out of planes to go and fight and, surrounded at Bastogne and all these things we know about them. It's a brilliant story. But let's not forget the blokes in the army who did the majority of the heavy lifting, the guys in the tanks, the Air Force, the guys behind the lines, the guys refueling tanks and cars and carrying supplies and working on ships, sailors bringing supplies across. The one thing we should always remember when we talk about particularly the world wars is collaboration. This was a combined effort of nations to win the war and all parts of the huge machine that makes up a military force. So I think it's important that we remember the 101st, we remember Easy Company. Great story. Read the book, watch the miniseries, remember them, but also remember everyone else that was the hundreds of thousands, the millions of other people that were fighting in the area at the same time.
I think what's great about the miniseries was that it just felt realistic, and it's in a time when CGI, computer generated imagery, was still not brilliant, but it's still. I don't know. There was something about it that was clever, and I think it was also that they brought in some of the original members of the company, and they would do their little spiel at the beginning or at the end of each episode, and it just gave you that connection to them. to such an extent that you can now go on an easy company tour from the coast to Berlin. It's just extraordinary how it's taken off and grabbed people's imagination, to the extent where people now will go and see the actors that played in it have become almost as important as the people that originally fought, most of whom sadly now have left us. So it's an interesting concept, but it is a great series. If you haven't seen it, then I would highly recommend it. And very often I refer to it even when I'm guiding on the First World War battlefields, because there are certain scenes during the film, and we're going to come back to it right at the end of this podcast, and certain scenes that are reminiscent of First World War fighting as well. So onwards, just up the hill, past the 101st Airborne Divisional Memorial, to a very unusual and yet spectacular memorial called the Madison Memorial. And I have to say, I had no idea until I was doing a bit of research for this podcast why it was called the Madison Memorial. I just never really thought it through. And it's purely the name of the hill. It's built on Madison Hill, so that's why it's called the Madison Memorial. It is in fact the American memorial to the Battle of the Bulge. That's what it is, and it's a huge 5-pointed American star. It's 12 meters high, so it's very high. You can go on top of it, so you can actually walk onto the top of the walls. It was designed by a Belgian architect, so these are the Belgians commemorating the American effort in this area. So it's not an American memorial. Now that's not quite true now, because it is at the moment. It's just been signed over to the American Monuments Commission on a 10-year lease. They are now looking after it, so they are going to monitor it. They normally have staff there that will help you find your way around. I haven't been since this happened. It's just recent that this has happened. It's been handed over to the American Monuments Commission. I suspect it also needs a bit of a refit, and they're paying for it, I would guess. So a 99-year lease, started in 2020. So literally just now. I haven't been back to the battlefield because of COVID. So it's I'm looking forward to seeing what they are going to do. It lists all of the American states on this memorial. It also lists battle honours. So the walls are just fantastic. 48 American states at that time. It's changed. I think it's 50 now. But 48 states. There's a section on this enormous 12 meter high star for each state, and then we have the unit badges emblazoned on it as well, which is quite interesting if you're interested in colour patches of American units. You could spend a lot of time looking at them.
Who isn't?
Exactly. It commemorates the 76,890 American casualties of the Bulge. Now be aware, casualties again is the figure, so that's not just the dead, it's also the wounded and the missing, etc. Inaugurated on the 4th of July, or perhaps what I should say, that the first sod was turned on the 4th of July 1946, inaugurated on the 16th of July 1950. And it was, and still is, I suppose, a Belgian state-owned site. And as I say, now looked after by the American Battle Monuments Commission for 99 years. So, as I said, you can walk to the top, and we have access up a little stairway to the top, and it is definitely worthwhile going up there. There are also directional pointers telling you which direction you're looking at. You can look down into the town. I think one of the points I haven't made is this is a very, very mountainous countryside, so we're high already, and this extra height gives us just fantastic views. If we walk down again to the centre of this star, we have, I suppose it's like an altar, I suppose, and on it's a big stone, and on it says, "The Belgian people remember their American liberators, 4th of July, 1946. So again, as we know, this is a Belgian memorial to the Americans. Now, one of the things that most people do not bother to go and look at, and you must, is to walk off the memorial, walk round to the front of it, the side that's facing the town, so you're looking down to Bastogne, and there is a crypt beneath it, and it's known as the Memorial Crypt. It has the most beautiful altars with behind mosaics, just fantastic mosaics. It's recognised as I suppose, a national piece of art in Belgium, and it's certainly well worth going. Not particularly well signposted. You need to just make the effort to go there. The 3 altars, one for the Protestants, one for the Catholics, and one for the Jews. So it's just a beautiful crypt underneath. It really does feel like there should be in the middle of it. There should be a kind of an unknown soldier or something there, and that's really, I suppose, the feel it was supposed to give. It was a place for people to go and to contemplate. People that had lost relatives, they could go down there, all denominational, and contemplate. So, yeah, it's well worth the effort. Make sure you go around and beneath the memorial to go and have a look at it.
One of the things I want to touch on there, Pete, that you mentioned, which we said this was a costly battle for the Americans, but how it cost 76,890 casualties in the Battle of the Bulge. That's a big old battle. I mean, when we talk about casualties, that is a lot of people killed and wounded in one action, albeit it went for a long time, but that is a huge number of casualties.
Yeah, it is indeed. I'm just going to look at the German casualties. German casualties are disputed, but they may have been as high as 120,000 men killed or wounded. And about 700 tanks destroyed. So, as we talked right at the beginning of this podcast, this was really the end of the German army. You know, to lose 700 tanks, and an awful lot of those tanks had to be abandoned, not necessarily destroyed in the way that we would imagine. They were abandoned because they ran out of fuel, they ran out of petrol. Most of the German tanks were running on petrol, not diesel, and they ran out, and they just had to walk away from them. So it was the end. The German army now is walking back into Germany.
Well, Pete, it's been a fascinating walk around the town of Bastogne. Anything else you want to show us before we finish up?
I'm just going to talk about one site that I've not been to. Every time I've been on tour here or visited or on a recce to have a look at the place is the Bastogne Barracks Museum, which is right in the centre of the town. It's towards the edge of the town, but it feels like it's in the middle of the town. And it was where the headquarters of the 101st Airborne Division actually were placed within these barracks. And it has an awful lot of hands-on tanks and equipment and things you can go and have a look at and actually touch. I can't tell you much more about it because, as I say, every time I've been, I have not been. And then just two more things really that I need to point out that you have to, if you're coming here and you're making the effort to go to Bastogne, then these are part of it. One of them is called Jack's Wood, and it's where Easy Company were, and I had the lucky situation of going there in the winter in the snow, and actually the foxholes have been redug, or they've been enhanced. In other words, they've filled in slowly, but they've dug them again. And it's the foxholes that the Easy Company held, looking down onto a village called Foy. And if you watch the episode in the Band of Brothers series, you'll know exactly why people go there. It is a very popular place to go. I try and go there, as we've mentioned it in other podcasts. Go there in the evening when it's getting dark or early in the morning, so you avoid anybody else being there, because it is spectacular. And a few years ago, I hit it when it was full of snow, just exactly the same temperatures as when they were there, when it was very snowy. So well worth going to have a look at. And then to go with it, and it's not far from this point, go to the German cemetery. There is a German war graves cemetery here at a place called, now again, Recoin, I think it's how you pronounce it, close to Foy, and that is well worth going to have a look at. Always very moving to go and look at the German cemeteries. 6,800 German soldiers are buried there. A lovely little chapel there, and the walls around it and the graves. You can spend an hour or two just wandering amongst the graves there.
We should always make that point. We implore you to go to the German cemeteries as well when you're on these battlefields. I mean, go to any military cemetery is always fascinating, but we should remember, especially after, we're on 80 years now since the Second World War, and we can put all the horrors of Nazism and the Holocaust aside in some respects to remember the poor blokes who had to go through this. And the reality is, if you're a poor bloke from Dresden or Strasbourg or wherever you were from, and fighting, you went through the same hardships as the blokes on the Allied side. And regardless of the ideology, it's just worth remembering. At the end of the day, the reason we visit these battlefields is to remember individuals who did extraordinary things. And it's worth going to the German cemeteries and remembering that these are sons and husbands and fathers as well.
This one's a little bit special as well. I should have mentioned. It actually was at one stage alongside the American cemetery for the area. That American cemetery was closed down and they were moved. So there were 2,500 American soldiers buried alongside the Germans here. And I think it's a little sad that they're not still here. I think it would be a nice juxtaposition to see them side by side. But it was decided that too few soldiers were going to be in the cemetery, and the Americans, generally speaking, centralised their burials. Most of the guys from this area went into Luxembourg, to the big American cemetery in Luxembourg. So there's nobody here now. There is a little memorial commemorating that there used to be an American cemetery alongside the German cemetery.
Well, Pete, as always, it's been a fascinating walk. I've really enjoyed this one, not actually having walked the ground. I know a lot about this battle. I've read a lot about it and spoken to a couple of veterans too, which was fantastic. But I've never actually walked the ground, and I certainly will. And this has made me determined that as soon as I can get back there, I'll tell you what, the first trip I do to the battlefields is going to be about 6 months long. I've got so much to see and do when I get over there. But a highlight of that, mate, is going to be walking with you across some of these famous grounds, because it's just such a treat. So thank you very much for sharing your knowledge on this very important site.
It's a pleasure, Matt. It's been very enjoyable.
1-800-Flowers.com knows that a gift is never just a gift. A gift is an expression of everything you feel and helps to build more meaningful relationships. 1-800-Flowers takes the pressure off by helping you navigate life's important moments by making it simple to find the perfect gift. From flowers and cookies to cake and chocolate, 1-800-Flowers helps guide you in finding the right gift to say how you feel. To learn more, visit 1-800-Flowers.com/ACAST. That's 1-800-Flowers.com/ACAST.
Bombas makes the most comfortable socks, underwear, and T-shirts.
Warning, Bombas are so absurdly comfortable you may throw out all your other clothes.
Sorry, do we legally have to say that?
No, this is just how I talk, and I really love my Bombas.
They do feel that good. And they do good, too. One item purchased equals one item donated.
To feel good and do good, go to bombas.com/ACAST and use code ACAST for 20% off your first purchase. That's BOMBAS.com/ACAST and use code ACAST at checkout.
If there's anything better than getting a few of your favorite things from McDonald's, it's getting a few of your favorite things from McDonald's for less in the McDonald's app. Delicious.
And what could be better than two of your favorites for $3.99? Like the 4-piece McNuggets, McDouble, or Hot and Spicy McChicken. So stop in for twice the delicious. Prices and participation may vary. Cannot be combined with any other offer. Single item at regular price. Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.